A man who had never flinched at a loaded gun, who had watched rivals beg for their lives without blinking, stood completely frozen in the middle of his own boardroom, staring at a woman covered in espresso, holding a shattered cup, breathing like she had just survived a car crash. His $1,000 suit was ruined. His entire executive team had stopped breathing. And Kang Min-jae, chairman of the Hanyul Syndicate, the most feared name in New York's underworld, said absolutely nothing. Because something in his chest, something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed, had just cracked open. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know she was about to destroy everything he thought he was. He only knew one thing in that moment. He wanted her to stay. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now settle in, because this is only the beginning. The rain had been falling over Manhattan since 4 in the morning, and by the time Nia Brooks stepped off the subway at 53rd Street, her umbrella had already betrayed her twice. The first time, the mechanism jammed and the canopy folded backward like a broken wing, leaving her standing on the platform while a gust of tunnel wind blasted her in the face. The second time, it simply collapsed mid-street, a quiet mechanical surrender, and she'd shoved it into an overflowing trash can on the corner of Park Avenue without looking back. She was already 6 minutes late. She had a coffee stain on the left cuff of her blazer from the commute, a stranger's elbow, a jostled paper cup, bad luck being the operating theme of her morning, and the heels she'd borrowed from her roommate Destiny were a half size too small, which meant every step on the wet pavement felt like a small punishment. She walked fast anyway, chin up, bag strap cinched across her body, navigating the sidewalk crowd with the focused intensity of someone who had survived worse beginnings. She had. That wasn't performance. Nia Renee Brooks was 26 years old, born and raised in Detroit, the second of 3 daughters in a household that operated on prayer, discipline, and whatever her mother could stretch from a paycheck that was never quite enough. She'd grown up watching her mother work double shifts, watching her older sister Keisha navigate the world with a protective armor of silence and suspicion, watching her younger sister Jade weaponize cuteness to survive. Nia had found her own method. She read everything she could get her hands on. Numbers, patterns, systems. She had the kind of brain that found irregular sequences calming, that saw buried connections in data the way other people saw shapes in clouds. She'd earned a scholarship, finished her degree in business analytics at the University of Michigan, and graduated into a job market that looked at her resume, looked at her, and then looked somewhere else. 4 jobs in 3 years. 2 layoffs, 1 company collapse, 1 position that evaporated the week after she accepted it. She'd been doing freelance bookkeeping and financial auditing for small businesses out of her Brooklyn apartment when a placement agency called with something different, something unusual. Their language on the phone had been careful, almost rehearsed. A private firm, very selective, exceptional compensation, immediate start, absolute confidentiality required. She'd asked the right questions and received almost no answers, which would have frightened a more cautious version of herself. The address on her phone was a glass tower on 55th Street with no sign above the entrance. Just polished steel doors, a doorman who checked her ID against a list with the expression of someone who had been trained to feel nothing, and an elevator that required a keycard she hadn't been given. "First day?" said a voice behind her. She turned. A Korean man in his late 30s, compact build, wire-rimmed glasses, charcoal suit, carrying a messenger bag over one shoulder. He was holding out a temporary access card between 2 fingers. "Mr. Lim," he said, "Director of Operations. I handle onboarding." He tapped the elevator panel with the card, and the doors opened. "You're 6 minutes late." "The rain?" Everyone in New York used that excuse this morning. "You're the only one I'm counting." He stepped inside. She followed. "You've reviewed the NDA?" "I signed it last week." "Reviewed it, not just signed it." She looked at him. "I know what I agreed to." Something shifted in his face. Not quite approval. More like recalibrated expectation. "The chairman runs the 13th floor. You won't interact with him directly for the first several weeks. You'll work with the executive assistant pool on 12, handle scheduling overflow, correspondence review, and financial documentation intake. Your primary supervisor is Ms. Park Ji-yeon." He paused. "Don't call her Ji-yeon." "What do I call her?" "Ms. Park. Or nothing." The elevator opened onto the 12th floor, and Naya stepped into a world so aggressively orderly it created its own kind of pressure. The office was large, pale, and precision designed. Low furniture, clean sight lines, art on the walls that said, expensive without saying anything else. Every desk was identical. Every monitor angle was identical. The people sitting at those desks moved with the synchronized quiet of people who had learned over time exactly how much sound was permitted. Ms. Park Ji-yeon met her at the reception threshold. Early 40s, posture like a measuring rod. Hair pulled back with the precision of someone who had decided years ago that visible effort was a weakness to be eliminated. She looked at Nia with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not warm. The look of someone doing an evaluation and withholding the score. Ms. Brooks. She extended a hand. Her grip was brief and exact. Your workstation is there. Your login credentials are in the sealed envelope on the desk. You'll shadow me for the first 2 days before working independently. She turned. Follow. Nia followed. The first hour was orientation by immersion. Ms. Park moved through the floor, explaining systems with the verbal economy of someone who expected to say everything once. Document classification protocols, communication hierarchies, routing procedures for contracts, financial reports, external correspondence. The infrastructure of the organization was sophisticated in ways that made Nia's analytical instincts quietly light up, multi-tiered, compartmentalized, built to prevent any single person from ever holding too complete a picture. She understood within the first 40 minutes that she was not working for a conventional corporation. She understood within the first 2 hours that the Hanul Group, as it was officially named, moved money and logistics through New York in ways that had nothing to do with whatever its public filings described. She didn't ask. She listened, cataloged, filed the understanding somewhere deep in private, and kept her face neutral. She was here for the paycheck. The paycheck was extraordinary. She had student loans that had been aging like wine. She had a mother in Detroit who needed a new furnace before October. She had no appetite for digging into the particular soil of this place's roots. What she had, as it turned out, was a talent for catastrophe. It began at 10:17 in the morning when she was retrieving a document file from the archive room, a long, narrow, space-lined floor to ceiling with labeled gray boxes, and misjudged the height of a rolling ladder, stepped off it 1 rung early, and landed hard against a shelving unit, which swayed, held, and then released a cascade of 3 archive boxes onto the floor. The sound was tremendous. 2 assistants appeared at the doorway with their faces arranged in identical expressions of disciplined alarm. Nia stood up, collected the scattered pages, reorganized them by section heading, and had them back in order before either assistant moved. One of them said carefully, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "The ladder's wheel is catching. Someone should get that fixed." She found out later from a junior assistant named Hana, who had made the tactical error of being kind to her, that the ladder had been broken for 2 months, and nobody had reported it because the archive room was Mr. Lim's domain, and nobody was volunteering to bring him maintenance requests. By noon, she had reported it, in writing, with a brief note about the liability this created. By 2 in the afternoon, she had reviewed 3 months of international shipping account documentation as part of her document intake assignment and found something she wasn't supposed to find. She wasn't even looking for it. She was organizing routing confirmation codes against a master logistics spreadsheet when she noticed the pattern. Small variations in the invoice reconciliation figures that were individually meaningless and collectively deliberate. Someone had been skimming from the shipping accounts, not aggressively, carefully. A fraction of a percent strategy designed to disappear inside rounding errors. But Nia had a specific kind of attention that didn't permit rounding errors. She stared at the screen for a long moment. She thought about the NDA. She thought about the fact that she didn't fully understand what this organization was or what you did when you found something wrong inside of it. She printed the relevant documents, put them in a folder, and placed the folder on Ms. Park's desk without a note. Then she went to the break room to get coffee because she needed coffee, and the break room on the 12th floor had a machine that cost more than her monthly rent and produced espresso with the quiet confidence of something that had never once had a bad morning. She poured a cup. She was turning to leave when the elevator doors opened and the entire floor changed. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't announced. He didn't raise his voice or make any sound that would justify the way every person in the room seemed to realign their posture, redirect their gaze toward their screens, reduce their visible breathing. He simply stepped out of the elevator, alone, no assistants trailing him, no visible entourage, and walked onto the floor with the easy, unhurried authority of someone who had never once had to perform dominance because he had never once lost it. Kang Min-jae was 38 years old, 6 feet of measured, careful movement. Dark hair, clean cut, face like something carved with intentions. Not handsome in any soft sense of the word, but precise, structured. The kind of face that registered everything while revealing nothing. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nia had made in her last 6 months of freelance work combined, and he moved through the space with the particular quality of a man who had long since stopped needing to check whether he was being watched. He was heading toward Miss Park's office. Nia was heading the opposite direction. The collision was not dramatic. It was simply physics and inattention. She turned out of the break room alcove at the exact moment he was passing it, her coffee-holding arm extended at the wrong angle, and the full cup of scalding espresso made contact with the center of his chest. Time performed the specific trick it does in the moments of catastrophic error. It slowed, it stretched, it gave her the full sensory experience of watching dark liquid spread across expensive white fabric, of the ceramic cup bouncing once on the floor before shattering, of the sound it made, of the absolute silence that followed. Every head on the floor turned. Everybody went still. Nia stood there with her hand still raised, holding nothing, brain cycling through responses and finding all of them inadequate. She looked at the stain on his shirt. She looked up at his face. He was looking at her. Not with rage, not with the explosive reaction that the room's collective held breath seemed to be anticipating. He was looking at her with the particular expression of a man encountering something genuinely unexpected. Measured, unreadable, still. She started. It's fine, he said. The 2 words landed in the room like stones dropped into water. Nia wasn't sure anyone else had exhaled. It is absolutely not fine, she said, because her mouth made decisions before her brain approved them. Your shirt is ruined. I'm so sorry. That was completely my fault. I wasn't looking. I know it was your fault, he said, without heat. Just information. Right. She pressed her lips together. Right, I'll pay for the shirt. The faintest thing moved across his face. Not quite amusement. Something more guarded. You'll pay for the shirt. Or the dry cleaning. Whichever. I don't actually know how much that shirt costs, and I'm not sure I want to... She stopped herself. I'm Nia Brooks. I started today. Which you probably didn't know because I'm one of probably 20 people on this floor, and you definitely have better things to think about than... She stopped again. I'm going to stop talking. Probably wise, he said. He held her gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. Then he continued toward Ms. Park's office without looking back. The floor remained silent for what felt like 10 full seconds after his door clicked shut. Then Hannah appeared at Nia's elbow and said, very quietly, Do you have any idea who that was? I have a guess, Nia said. The last person who spilled something on him, Hannah said, transferred to the Seattle office the next morning. Seattle's a nice city. They didn't want to go. Nia bent down, collected the pieces of the broken cup, and placed them on a nearby desk with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time to regulate their own heartbeat. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. She was not fired that day. She half expected it every hour of the afternoon. A tap on the shoulder, an email, a summons to HR. It didn't come. What came instead at 4 in the afternoon was Ms. Park appearing at her workstation with the folder Nia had left on her desk, holding it with both hands, and wearing an expression that Nia couldn't fully categorize. You found this in the shipping account documentation, Ms. Park said. Yes. You weren't asked to audit the accounts. You were asked to catalog and route. I know. Nia kept her voice level. I was routing the documents when I noticed the pattern. I thought it should be flagged. You thought. Ms. Park looked at the folder, then at Nia. What's your analytical background? Nia gave her the short version. Degree, focus, freelance auditing experience. Ms. Park was quiet for a moment. This discrepancy, she said. Walk me through what you found. So Nia walked her through it. She pulled up the spreadsheet on her monitor and traced the pattern, the invoice reconciliation variances, the 3-month timeline she'd been able to reconstruct, the accumulation rate, and her estimate of total diversion based on the documents she'd had access to. Ms. Park stood behind her chair and said nothing while she explained. When Nia finished, the silence lasted long enough that she wondered if she'd made an error. Then Ms. Park said, Wait here. She took the folder and walked directly to the elevator. She went up. Nia sat at her workstation and listened to the sound of her own breathing and tried not to calculate the probability that she had just committed some kind of catastrophic error on her first day at a job she desperately needed. 40 minutes later, Ms. Park returned. She handed Nia a new document, an expanded access authorization, signed with the chairman's office stamp. You've been granted access to the full shipping account archive. 3 years. You'll complete a comprehensive audit and report to me directly. Ms. Park's expression remained controlled, but something precise moved inside it. This is not your primary assignment. This is secondary work. Ms. Brooks? She paused at the desk. You'll find the work on this floor requires a certain kind of discretion. I understand discretion, Nia said. I'm sure you understand the concept, Ms. Park said, with just enough weight to make the distinction clear. Good night. She left. Nia sat alone at her workstation in the emptying office and looked at the expanded access document and thought about the furnace in her mother's house in Detroit and the student loan statement on her kitchen counter and the way the man upstairs had looked at her. Not with anger, not with dismissal, but with something she couldn't name yet, something that had looked almost like genuine attention. She went home, changed out of the ruined blazer, made dinner, and called her mother. How was the first day? Her mother asked. Eventful, Nia said. Good eventful or bad eventful? Nia looked at the ceiling of her Brooklyn apartment and considered the question from multiple angles. Not sure yet, she said. Ask me in a month. She didn't sleep well that night. The numbers from the shipping accounts were still running in her head. Not the discrepancy she'd found, which she'd already mapped clearly, but the larger patterns underneath it. The architecture of the accounts, the sophistication of the concealment. Whoever had built it had understood the system intimately, which meant it was someone inside, someone senior, someone trusted enough to move numbers in ways that wouldn't generate automatic flags. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and let her brain do what it did, find shapes and things that looked like noise. And by 3 a.m, she had a theory she couldn't prove yet but believed in with the specific confidence that preceded her best work. She kept it to herself until she could. The second week went differently than the first. She was still clumsy. That was not a condition that responded to professional environment. She walked into a glass partition on Tuesday morning with enough force to leave a smudge and the sound of every person in the room turning simultaneously to look at her. She knocked a full wastebasket over on Thursday by catching it with her heel while carrying a stack of binders, which distributed recyclable paper across approximately 12 feet of office floor. On Friday, she dropped her phone under Ms. Park's desk while delivering documents and had to retrieve it while Ms. Park conducted a phone call, a maneuver that required her to be on her hands and knees under a senior executive's desk for a period that felt significantly longer than the 30 seconds it actually was. Each time, she recovered, repaired, continued. What also happened in the second week was that she began to make herself useful in ways that were not in her job description and that she did not advertise. She reorganized the document intake queue to eliminate a bottleneck that had been causing 2-day processing delays. She created a cross-reference index for the archive room that reduced retrieval time by a factor that made Hannah stare at it with open gratitude. She found 2 additional irregularities in accounts adjacent to the shipping documentation, smaller, older, and in a different signature than the first discrepancy, which meant a different source, which meant the problem was not isolated. She put each finding in a folder on Ms. Park's desk. Ms. Park received each one with the same controlled expression and the same brief acknowledgement, and each time went directly to the elevator. By the end of the second week, Nia understood that her findings were going directly to the chairman. She understood this not because anyone told her, no one told her anything, but because she was good at reading systems, and the system's response to her work was not the response of middle management making decisions. It was the response of middle management transmitting information upward and executing instructions that arrived back with speed and precision. On Monday of the third week, a senior captain named G1 was escorted from the building by 2 men in suits while his workstation was being cleared. Nia happened to be at the printer when it happened and watched it through the glass with the flat recorded attention of someone cataloging data rather than reacting to it. Hannah appeared beside her. That's the third one, Hannah said very quietly. Third what? Hannah looked at her. Third person in 6 months. She paused. The chairman doesn't miss things. He just sometimes needs them found. Nia looked at Jiwon's face as he passed the glass. He was not being physically harmed. He looked instead like a man watching an inevitable horizon arrive. She'd seen that expression on people who'd been laid off from companies she'd audited. That particular collapse of the pretense that things were going to be fine. She went back to her desk. She was halfway through a report when her desk phone rang. A specific number she recognized from the internal directory, the one she'd memorized during orientation, the way she memorized most things, automatically, without effort. 13. The chairman's floor. She picked up. Ms. Brooks? His voice on the phone was exactly what she would have anticipated. Not loud, not warm, carrying its own particular gravity through telephone static. Come up. The line went dead. Nia sat for a moment, phone in her hand, then placed it back in its cradle with the care of someone making a deliberate choice not to react visibly. She saved her document. She straightened her jacket. She checked briefly that she wasn't carrying anything that could be spilled. The elevator to 13 required Ms. Park's keycard, which Ms. Park provided when Nia appeared at her office door with the phone call information. Ms. Park's face showed nothing, but she held out the card with a specific deliberateness that communicated something Nia filed away for later. The 13th floor was different from the 12th, the way a cathedral is different from a conference room. Same structural logic, different weight, darker materials, more space between things, less visible activity. A single assistant at a desk outside a set of double doors looked up when she stepped off the elevator and said, "He's expecting you," without being asked. She knocked. "Come." The office was large, corner-facing, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking rain-dark Manhattan from two sides. The furniture was heavy and deliberate, not designed to impress, designed to last. No art on the walls. A single shelf of books along the inner wall, red, she noted automatically, with cracked spines and occasional small marks along pages. A desk, uncluttered, with a precision that spoke less of cleanliness than of absolute control over what was permitted to occupy space. Minjae was standing at the window when she entered. He didn't turn immediately. Below them, Park Avenue moved in its wet, indifferent rhythm. "Close the door," he said. She did. He turned. Up close, without the shock of the coffee incident and the audience of 30 people in her own galloping heartbeat, she had the chance to actually look at him. The face held up, controlled in the way of someone who had learned young that expression was information and information was leverage, and both should be rationed. Dark eyes, steady, a line to his jaw that suggested a man who clenched it regularly and had stopped noticing. He was carrying tension in his shoulders the way you carry something you've long since stopped registering as weight. "Sit," he said. She sat. He remained standing, which she registered as a power geometry. Not accidental, not theatrical, simply the configuration that felt natural to him. "You found the accounts?" "Yes." "You weren't asked to look?" "No." She met his eyes. "I was routing documents. The patterns were visible. I didn't feel like it would have been useful to pretend they weren't." Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. "Most people on that floor would have pretended." "I know." "Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly without it sounding like a performance of integrity. "I'm not good at letting patterns go unresolved," she said. "It's not particularly noble. It just bothers me when things don't add up." He studied her. "You found 3 captains." "I found evidence." "You found the captains." A pause. "You know what I do," he said. It was not a question. "I have a reasonable working theory," she said carefully, "and that doesn't trouble you." "It would be inaccurate to say it doesn't trouble me at all." She kept her voice steady. "But I'm also practical. I signed an agreement. I needed this position. I do the work I'm asked to do. I report what I find honestly, and I don't ask questions that would require you to give me answers you'd prefer not to give." He was quiet for long enough that she became aware of the rain against the glass. "You're going to continue the audit," he said, "if you want me to." "I don't ask people to do things I'm ambivalent about," he said. 3 years of shipping accounts, full access. You'll report directly to me from this point. Not through Ms. Park." Nia absorbed this. "All right. Is there something you want to ask?" "Yes," she said, before she could stop herself. He waited. The first discrepancy. The one in the shipping accounts. It wasn't the only pattern. The architecture of it was deliberate. Someone built it to be invisible inside normal operation. She paused. "I think there's more than 3 captains. I think there's someone further up the chain who gave them access or cover. The 3 you removed, they were executing something, not originating it." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. She watched something happen behind his eyes. Not surprise. She had the impression he was difficult to surprise. more like the careful repositioning of a piece on a board. "How long," he said slowly, "have you believed this?" "I got to the theory around 3 a.m. last Thursday," she said. "I didn't bring it forward because I wanted to trace the account structure further before saying something I couldn't back up. And now? Now I'm reasonably sure I can back it up, but I need deeper access than I currently have." He crossed to his desk, sat, pulled a notepad toward him. "What access?" She told him. Specific account tiers, internal fund routing codes, a particular class of international wire transfer documentation that would require authorization she didn't have. He wrote without looking up, pen moving in a script she couldn't read. When she finished, he put the pen down. "You'll have it by morning." "All right." He looked at her across the desk. "You know what happens to people who find things they weren't meant to find." "I'm aware of the general principle," she said. "The men you helped me remove tonight were not good men," he said, with the flat specificity of a statement rather than a justification. "But they were part of this organization. There's a cost to that kind of finding." "I understand." "Do you?" She held his gaze. "I found something that was damaging your organization, and I reported it. That seems straightforwardly aligned with my employment situation. The cost you're describing doesn't change what the right action was." He was quiet, then, "You're not afraid of me." She considered that. "I have some situational anxiety about this conversation," she said honestly, "but afraid of you specifically? No." The pause stretched. "Why not?" Because when he'd looked at her in the break room hallway, that first moment, standing in the hallway in a ruined shirt with half the executive floor watching, there had been something in his eyes that wasn't anger, wasn't cruelty, wasn't the calculated calm of a man deciding what to do with a problem. It had been something older than that, something that looked from where she sat like recognition. She didn't say any of that. "You haven't given me a reason to be," she said. He studied her for a moment that lasted slightly too long to be purely evaluative. Then he turned back to his desk. "That will do, Ms. Brooks. I'll have your access updated tonight. Report directly to me when you have your findings consolidated." She stood. "And Ms. Brooks," she stopped at the door, "don't bring coffee onto this floor." The tone was dry, just barely. She faced the door so he couldn't see the expression that moved across her face. Something surprised, something involuntary, something that felt inappropriately close to a smile. "Understood," she said, and left. She rode the elevator back to 12, collected her bag, and walked out into the rain-wet evening, and spent the entire subway ride home arguing with herself about the fact that she'd been paying attention up there in that corner office to things she had absolutely no business noticing. The tension in his shoulders, the cracked spines on those books, the way he'd said why not as a challenge, but as something quieter. She told herself it was professional observation, data collection, the habit of noticing patterns. She was good at lying to herself until the numbers stopped adding up. And right now the numbers were adding up in a direction she needed to stop looking at. She bought a coffee from the street cart on her corner, went home, opened her laptop, and got back to work. 4 floors above the street, in an office with 2 walls of rain-dark glass, Kong Min-jae sat at his desk with the notepad in front of him and the list of access codes she'd requested, and did not immediately begin drafting the authorization memo. Instead, he sat still, which was unusual for him. He did not usually sit still when there was work to do, and thought about the woman who had looked him in the eye and said, "You haven't given me a reason to be," with the steadiness of someone who had been measuring him honestly and arrived at a verdict that had nothing to do with what everyone else in that building already believed. In 14 years, he could not recall the last time someone had looked at him that way. He drafted the authorization memo. He called his head of security. He gave 2 instructions, one professional, one that he phrased as security protocol, and that was only partly that because there was a new employee in this building who had in the space of 3 weeks made herself indispensable and visible in equal measure, and the men who wanted to hurt him had a long history of targeting what he failed to protect. He had learned that lesson once. He was not inclined to learn it again. He did not examine too closely why this particular employee felt like a more urgent version of the usual precaution. He went back to work. What neither of them knew, not yet, was that in a waterfront office in Red Hook, 3 miles away, a man named Park Seok-hyun was sitting across a table from Ji-won, who had been escorted from a building that morning and who was now extremely interested in sharing information about the internal systems of the Hanul Syndicate, about the new auditor, about what she'd found. about the fact that the chairman had given her access to 3 years of financial architecture in a single afternoon, which was not the way Kang Min-jae operated with anyone. Not his lieutenants, not his oldest captains, not the men who had been with him since the beginning. Seo Kyun was a careful man. He did not jump to conclusions. He built them, slowly, with evidence. He was, at this particular moment, beginning to build one, and it had Nia Brooks's name on it. The access codes arrived at 6:14 in the morning. Nia was already awake, had been since 5, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, because her brain had decided sleep was optional when there were unresolved patterns in reach. She was still in the oversized Michigan sweatshirt she'd slept in, hair wrapped, feet bare on the cold linoleum, and she was tracing account architecture with the focused, slightly manic energy she recognized in herself as the particular state that preceded her best work and her worst decisions. The email came from an address she didn't recognize. A string of numbers, no name, no signature line. Just the access codes in the body of the message, formatted with clean precision, and a single line at the bottom. This comes from the top. Use it carefully. She read the line twice. Then she opened the first restricted account tier and started working. By 8:30, she had confirmed what she'd suspected Thursday night. By 9, she had a cleaner picture of how it was structured. By 10, when she arrived on the 12th floor, still carrying the mental map of what she'd found overnight, she was operating on 2 hours of fragmented sleep and the specific kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing you're holding something dangerous. The floor felt different that morning. She noticed it in the way she noticed most things, not dramatically, not all at once, but accumulating. The quiet was slightly different. The assistants at their identical workstations were moving with a fraction more tension in their shoulders than usual. Hana, who typically met her near the coffee machine with the small conspiratorial energy of a coworker who had decided to be kind in an environment that didn't reward it, was at her desk with her eyes forward and her body arranged in a posture that said, "Not today, don't ask." Nia got her own coffee. She sat at her workstation. She opened her secure documents folder and began organizing her overnight findings into a coherent report format, because however urgent the information felt inside her head, it was useless until it was legible to someone else. She was 40 minutes into this when Mr. Lim stopped at the edge of her workstation. She looked up. He was carrying a tablet, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. The professional neutrality still in place, but something underneath it that she categorized without complete certainty as concern. "The chairman wants the consolidated report on his desk by noon," he said. "I'll be ready." He didn't move. She waited. "Ms. Brooks." He lowered his voice without making a performance of it. "What you found in those accounts, it's a significant matter." "I know. The people involved in a matter like this..." He paused, selected his next words with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating around what they actually meant. "They don't respond well to exposure." She met his eyes. "Are you warning me about something specific?" "I'm telling you to be aware of your surroundings," he said. "That's all." He left. She sat for a moment with that. Then she went back to her report. At 11:50, she took the elevator to 13 with a printed copy of her findings, 12 pages, annotated, with supporting documentation, and the digital version on a secure drive. The assistant outside the chairman's office waved her through without ceremony this time, which she registered as a data point about how fast a person's status in a building could shift. Min-jae was at his desk, reading something, when she entered. He didn't look up immediately. She stood in front of the desk and waited, because she had the sense that this was a man who noticed everything and that rushing him would be its own kind of error. He looked up. "Report," he said. She laid the printed copy on his desk and walked him through it standing, not because she'd planned to present it that way, but because sitting felt passive for information this weighted. She walked him through the account architecture, the concealment method, the 3-year timeline and accumulation rate. She showed him the 2 lower-level discrepancies that matched the first in construction, but differed in signature. Different hands building the same kind of infrastructure, which meant coordination, which meant someone above the 3 removed captains had been providing either the method or the protection. When she got to the relevant documentation, the internal fund routing records for the specific tier she'd accessed overnight, she placed the page in front of him and pointed to a sequence of authorization codes. "These codes appear in the routing records for all 3 discrepancy signatures," she said. "They're not attached to any of the 3 captains. They're attached to an internal account that I can trace to an origin, but not to a name, because the account is held under a subsidiary entity. He was looking at the page. His face had gone to a particular stillness she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled composure of the man managing his expression, but something deeper and colder. "Which subsidiary?" he said. She told him. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Kang Min-jae sat completely motionless, and Nia watched something happen in his eyes that she didn't fully understand, but that made the temperature of the room feel different. He put the page down. "Leave the report," he said. His voice had changed. Not louder, not rougher, but compressed, the way a structure sounds different when it's under load. "Go back to your floor. Don't discuss what you found with anyone. Not Ms. Park, not Lim, no one." "All right. Ms. Brooks?" She stopped. "The subsidiary," he said. "Do you know whose it is?" "I have a strong working theory," she said. "I didn't put it in the report because I couldn't source it to documentation I'm confident in." He was looking at her. "Tell me the theory." She told him. She watched his jaw set. Not a flinch. He didn't flinch. More like a calculation completing behind his eyes, arriving at a result he had apparently been hoping to avoid. "Go back to your floor," he said again. Quieter this time. "Don't leave the building until I tell you to." She left. The afternoon moved with the specific, unbearable quality of waiting when you know something is coming and you don't know its shape. Nia sat at her workstation and did the secondary work she'd been assigned, document routing, scheduling, overflow, with a surface concentration that left the deeper part of her brain completely free to run through what she'd seen in his face when she'd named the subsidiary. She'd seen it for only a second before he'd locked it back down. But she'd seen it. It was something she recognized from watching her mother receive bad news. That particular look of a person being told that someone they trusted had been lying to them. At 3 in the afternoon, the elevator doors on the 12th floor opened and 2 men she didn't recognize walked onto the floor. They were not in the building's usual suit and controlled expression uniform. They were harder, more direct in the way they moved, with the particular body language of men who operated further out on the organization's edge than the administrative core. They went directly to the desk of a senior logistics manager named Bayoon, a man in his mid-40s who had worked on the floor since before Nia arrived, who wore quiet suits and spoke little, and had always given her the specific impression of someone who was very careful about what he let show. Bayoon saw them coming. He was out of his chair before they reached his desk. He moved fast enough that Nia had half a second to think he might run. But there was nowhere to run on this floor, and the men were faster and had anticipated exactly this. One of them took his arm at the elbow with the brisk practicality of someone who had done this before. Bayoon stopped. He looked at the man holding his arm. Then he looked across the floor, not at anyone specific, just at the space of the floor itself, with an expression that Nia would think about later. The particular look of a man watching something he'd constructed over years simply stop existing. They walked him to the elevator. The doors closed. The floor was absolutely silent. Then one by one, people went back to their screens. Hana didn't look at Nia. Nobody did. That was its own kind of communication. Nia went back to her screen too. Her hands were steady on the keyboard. The part of her brain that dealt with moral weight and consequence was doing complex, uncomfortable work that she didn't have the space to deal with right now. She filed it. She kept moving. At 4:30, Min-jae appeared on the 12th floor. Not through the elevator from above, through the stairwell door, which she'd never seen him use, and which explained why the floor didn't get the usual 3-second adjustment period before he arrived. He was in his shirt sleeves, jacket gone, which was the first time she'd seen him without it, and which registered as significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate. He went directly to Mr. Lim's office and closed the door. She could not hear the conversation. She could see it through the interior glass, the posture of it, the geometry. Min-jae standing, Lim sitting, then standing, expression moving through a sequence of responses that settled into the specific composure of a man receiving information and managing his reaction to it. A short exchange. Lim nodded twice. Min-jae turned and left the office, and on his way back to the stairwell door, he passed Nia's workstation. He didn't stop walking. He didn't look directly at her. But in the 2 seconds he was adjacent to her desk, he said, low enough that only she could hear it, "You did good work today." Then he was through the stairwell door and gone. Nia sat very still for a moment. Then she saved her document, put on her jacket, and went to the bathroom to run cold water on her wrists and have a private conversation with herself about the fact that 4 words delivered in a hallway at a volume nobody else could hear had done something to her chest that she needed to categorically stop thinking about. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror and said quietly, out loud, because her mother had always told her that the things you refuse to say to yourself out loud are the things that get you in trouble. Absolutely not. He is your employer. He runs a criminal organization. You are here to audit financial accounts and survive long enough to pay off your student loans. You are not here to notice that he looked different without the jacket. She dried her hands. She went back to her desk. She noticed on the way that someone had placed a small white paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks east, the expensive one, the Korean one on 53rd, on the corner of her desk. No note. No name. The bag contained 2 honey butter pastries, which happened to be the thing she'd mentioned to Hana 3 days ago, in a throwaway comment about missing the Korean bakery near her old apartment in Bed-Stuy. She sat down slowly. She looked at the bag for a long moment. Then she looked at the ceiling and had another short private conversation with herself, this one conducted entirely without words. She ate both pastries. They were extraordinary. The following morning was a Wednesday, and it started badly before she arrived. She got a call on the subway from Destiny, her roommate, her closest friend in the city, a woman who communicated primarily through voice notes and strong opinions, who had found something on the internet about a Korean organized crime figure in New York and wanted to know if it was remotely related to the private firm where Nia worked. Nia said, "I can't talk about my employer," in a voice that she intended to be casual and that communicated everything. Destiny was quiet for approximately 1 second. "Nia Renee, I'm on the subway. You're standing on a moving subway car lying to me with your whole face, even though I can't see your face? I really can't. Are you safe?" The word landed differently than any of the previous ones. Nia held on to the overhead bar and watched the tunnel walls go past and thought about how to answer that honestly. "Yes," she said, and believed it, which was its own complicated data point. "You need to tell me more than that." "I will. Not now. I'll call you tonight." She didn't call that night because that night was when the thing with Park Seo-hyun started to move from background threat to foreground event. And by the time she understood that, she was already inside it. It came through work channels, which was the part she kept thinking about afterward. How ordinary its beginning was. She was running a cross-reference on a set of international wire transfer records, one of the document tiers she'd been granted access to through the expanded authorization, and she found a routing signature she didn't recognize. Not from the Hanuel accounts. External. Attached to a secondary document in the batch that shouldn't have been there. Filed in the wrong folder, either by accident or by someone who needed it to be findable by the right person. She looked at it for a long time. The routing signature belonged to a financial shell entity she'd seen referenced once, peripherally, in a law enforcement database summary she'd come across years ago during a freelance auditing contract for a shipping logistics company in Queens. She'd been researching regulatory compliance at the time. She remembered it because the summary had used the phrase Park-affiliated network and attached it to a set of Port Authority irregularities that had ultimately gone nowhere officially. Park. She looked up Park Seo-hyun on nothing. No search engine, no internal database, nothing she'd been given access to. She looked him up inside her own memory because what she'd filed away 3 years ago in the Queen's contract had included a name, and now that name had a shape in the current context that made her hands go very still on the keyboard. She printed the document. She folded it. She put it in her jacket pocket rather than a folder, because she had the sudden instinct, not rational, not documented, just the particular alarm system she'd developed growing up in environments where you learned to read the temperature of a room before you entered it, that this was not something to move through the floor's regular channels. She went upstairs. Not called. Just went. The assistant outside his office looked up with slightly raised eyebrows. "He's in a meeting. It won't take long," Nia said, and knocked. A beat of silence. Then, "Come." There were 2 other men in the office when she entered. His senior lieutenants. She'd learned their names by now. Men named Cho and Bayek, who had the particular build and presence of people who handled the organization's less administrative requirements. They both looked at her with the specific expression of men who had been in the middle of something and were recalculating what her appearance meant. Min-jae looked at her face first. She watched him read it. Not the expression she was wearing, which she'd worked to keep neutral, but something underneath it. He was very good at that. She was only now understanding how good. Give us a minute, he said, without looking at Cho or Beck. They left. Beck pulled the door shut behind him with the care of a man who understood that the conversation inside was not his. Nia crossed to the desk and put the document in front of him. She watched him look at it. She watched the quality of his stillness change. "Where did you find this?" he said. Not a question, the tone of a man already running the answer forward into consequences. "Wire transfer records. Misfiled. Could be an accident." "It's not an accident." He picked up the document. His eyes moved over it with the focused speed of someone who could read this particular language, the language of financial infrastructure and what it meant in physical terms, in territorial terms, in threat terms. "Seok-hyun is moving money through the port accounts." He set it down. "How long has this routing signature been in our transfer records?" "The earliest instance I can trace it to is 6 weeks ago." He was quiet. 6 weeks, he said. "Yes." "You understand what that means?" She had theories. "Tell me." He looked at her across the desk with the directness of someone deciding, in real time, to stop managing how much a person knew. "It means he's been running intelligence on our port operations for 6 weeks. It means he has someone inside the accounts, inside the routing systems, not just the captains we removed. Someone still here." He paused. "Someone who has been watching what you found and reporting back on what we did about it." The implications of that moved through her in sequence. She absorbed them without letting them reach her face. "That means he knows about me," she said. Min-jae looked at her steadily. "Yes." The room was very quiet. "I want you to move your work to the 13th floor starting tomorrow," he said. "I want you here, on this floor, where I can—" He stopped, restarted. "Where the security infrastructure is better." She noticed the stop and restart. She filed it away and said nothing about it. "All right." He stood. He moved to the window, that default position of his, and looked out at the city with the expression of a man recalculating a defensive perimeter. She watched his reflection in the glass, the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of someone moving through the decision-making process and not finding options he liked. "He's going to try to use you," he said to the window. "Seok-hyun, he's not subtle about leverage. He'll have identified you as the variable that changed the situation." A pause. "And he'll have identified something else." She waited. He turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before that. Not the evaluative professional attention, not the compressed system authority, but something more exposed, something that required more effort to look at directly. "He'll have identified that you matter to the outcome of this, that removing you would be efficient from his perspective." She held his gaze. "You're telling me I'm a target. I'm telling you to take it seriously." "I do take it seriously." "You don't take anything the way most people take it," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not criticism, not quite frustration, not quite anything she had a clean word for. "You received information this morning that should have made you go home and reconsider this position entirely. You came upstairs instead." "I came upstairs because you needed to know what I found." "Most people," he said, "who discovered they were in the middle of a situation like this would have left the building." "I'm not most people." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You're not." Something moved across his face, brief, unguarded, gone before she could catalog it. "That worries me considerably." She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't try to do anything with it. She just stood there, in the middle of his office, with the rain starting against the windows, and looked at a man who was telling her she was in danger with an expression that communicated the danger mattered to him in a way that was not purely organizational. And she kept her face calm and her breathing even, and told herself very firmly that she would examine the implications of this later, in private, where she didn't have to look at him while doing it. "I'll be on this floor tomorrow morning," she said. "Good." She left. She took the elevator back to 12. She sat at her desk. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Destiny that said, "I'm fine. I'll explain when I can. Don't worry." She sent it, looked at it, typed a second message that said, "And Destiny, don't tell anyone where I work." She stared at that one for a second before sending it. Then she put her phone face down on her desk and went back to work, because work was the thing she could control. And control was what she had instead of certainty, and right now certainty felt very far away. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing yet, sitting at her desk in the orderly quiet of the 12th floor, was that 3 floors below, in the building's parking garage, A black SUV had been idling for 40 minutes with its engine running and its occupants watching the elevator indicator above the lobby bank. They were waiting for a woman they had a photograph of, a name, and a specific set of instructions regarding. They were not Seok-hyun's people. Not exactly. They were the kind of people Seok-hyun hired when he wanted to send a message first and escalate second. The instructions were not to take her tonight. The instructions were to let her see them, to make sure she understood that she had been seen, that the perimeter of whatever safety she thought she had was thinner than she knew. And at 6:17, when Nia Brooks walked through the lobby and pushed through the building's glass doors into the wet November evening, pulling her bag strap across her body, turning up her collar against the rain, already running through transfer record sequences in her head, she walked directly past the parked SUV without looking at it. But the man in the passenger seat looked at her. He raised his phone. He took a photograph, and he sent it to a contact labeled simply "Boss" with a message that read, "Confirmed. She's exactly what you said. How do you want to proceed?" 3 miles away in Red Hook, Park Seok-hyun looked at the photograph on his phone for a long moment. He set the phone face down on his desk. He picked up a glass of water, drank from it, set it back with the precise placement of a man who did not make. Park Seok-hyun set his phone face down on the desk with the careful placement of a man who had already made his decision and no longer needed to look at the evidence. "Slowly," he said to the man across the table. "We move slowly." He picked up his glass of water. He drank. He set it back in exactly the same ring mark on the wood. "She's not the target," he said. "She's the key." 3 miles north, Nia was walking through the rain toward the subway entrance on 53rd, completely unaware that she had just been classified. Not as a person, as an instrument, as the specific pressure point on a specific man that Seok-hyun had been looking for since the Hanul Syndicate had begun dismantling his port operations 6 months ago, quietly, systematically, with the particular surgical patience that was Kang Min-jae's signature. She went home. She ate leftover rice standing at the kitchen counter because she forgot to sit down. She called her mother, kept it short, kept it light, did not say anything about the SUV she hadn't even noticed, about the photograph she didn't know had been taken, about the way the chairman of the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast had said that "worries me considerably" in a voice that had not sounded organizational at all. She went to bed. She slept badly. She was on the 13th floor by 7:45 the next morning. Min-jae's assistant, a composed young man named Seo, who had apparently been briefed on her arrival, showed her to a workstation that had been set up in the outer office, adjacent to the assistant's own desk, close enough to the double doors that she could hear movement inside the chairman's office without being able to hear content. The workstation was better than the one on 12. The monitor was larger. The secure drive access had been upgraded. There was a coffee machine on the credenza 3 feet to her left that she treated with the specific respect of someone who had recently destroyed a man's $1,000 shirt. She plugged in. She opened her files. She went back to work. The first hour was quiet in the way that expensive, controlled environments are quiet. Not empty, but managed. Seo moved efficiently at his own desk. Cho came through twice, both times with documents. Both times with the brisk purposefulness of a man who communicated through motion rather than words. The building's ambient pressure, the particular kind that lived in the walls of a place where serious decisions were made, felt different on this floor. Denser. She was running a cross-reference on the secondary routing signatures, trying to trace the internal leak, the person still inside the organization who had been feeding Seok-hyun, when the pattern she found stopped her completely. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the screen. She looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something when your brain is telling you what it means, and another part of your brain is working very hard to find an alternate interpretation that doesn't lead where the first one does. There wasn't one. The routing codes, the access signature, the specific tier of internal financial infrastructure that would have required both intimate system knowledge and a particular level of organizational trust to navigate. She'd been tracing it for 2 days, building toward a name through a process of elimination that had felt slow and frustrating and was now, suddenly, complete. She knew the name. She did not want to know the name. She printed the documentation, slowly, 1 page at a time, like the deliberateness of the action could alter what the pages said. She stacked them. She held them. She stood up from the workstation and knocked on the double doors and didn't wait for the response before she pushed them open, because she had learned in the 5 weeks she'd been in this building that there were moments when waiting was its own kind of damage. Min-jae was on the phone. He looked up when the door opened with the expression of a man calibrating the interruption, and something in her face made him say into the phone, "I'll call you back." He set it down. "What?" She crossed to his desk and placed the documents in front of him without a word. She stood back. She watched his face while he read. He read slowly. She'd noticed this about him. He didn't skim. He moved through text with the methodical attention of someone who understood that speed in reading produced the same errors as speed in decisions. His eyes moved line by line. His face was controlled, as it always was, the professional composure intact. Then he reached the third page. She watched the composure do something she hadn't seen it do before. It didn't break. It was too structural for that, too long built. But it shifted, the way a wall shifts before it shows the crack, something changing in the load distribution behind his eyes. He set the page down. He was quiet for long enough that the rain against the windows became audible. "How certain are you?" he said. "The signature appears in 47 separate transactions across 14 months, she said. The access codes map to a single internal account. The account is registered to a subsidiary that I traced through 3 layers of shell structure." She kept her voice flat, informational, because that was the only register she could trust right now. "I'm certain." He picked the page back up. He looked at the name at the bottom, the name she'd put in a box alone, separate from the supporting documentation, because it deserved to be looked at by itself. Kim Sung-ho, Chief Financial Officer. 22 years with the Hanuel organization. The man who had built the financial architecture that Nia had been auditing. The man who had, she now understood, known exactly where everybody was buried because he had helped dig the graves. The man who had been selling those burial sites to Park Seok-hyun for 14 months. He built the concealment method used by the 3 captains, Nia said. I thought they developed it independently. They didn't. He gave it to them. He gave them the access, the routing codes, the cover. They were skimming for themselves, yes, but the real purpose was to create controlled chaos. Give Min-jae enough internal corruption to chase that he wouldn't look at the larger infrastructure being sold underneath it. She paused. I was handed the smaller fires. I was supposed to keep looking at those while the bigger one burned. Min-jae was not looking at the paper anymore. He was looking at the middle distance, at a point somewhere between the desk and the far wall, and the quality of his stillness had changed again. This time into something she didn't have a word for, something older and harder. The stillness of a man processing not just tactical betrayal, but the specific weight of 14 years of proximity to a person who had been measuring the distance to his throat the entire time. He was at my father's funeral, Min-jae said. He said it quietly. Not to her. Just said it into the room. She didn't respond. She understood that there were moments that required silence, and this was one of them. He stood. He moved to the window. The city below was gray and wet, moving with its usual indifferent momentum, and he stood with his back to her, and she watched the line of his shoulders and understood that she was witnessing something most people in this building would never see. The chairman not performing authority, but simply being a man standing in front of the weight of something that couldn't be managed away. Then he turned. The expression had reset. The control was back, complete, architectural. Whatever she'd seen in those 12 seconds was gone, filed somewhere inaccessible. Where is he now? He said. His car is in the parking garage. He arrived at 7:15. Something moved in Min-jae's eyes. How do you know when his car arrived? I pulled the garage access logs this morning, she said. I've been pulling them every morning since you told me there was an internal leak. I didn't know who I was looking for, but I knew the person would need physical access to the building's financial server room, which requires a key-coded garage entry after hours. She paused. He's been entering the garage at irregular hours approximately twice a week for the past 3 months. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read what was behind the look, except that it was not a simple thing. Call Cho, he said. Tell him to come up. You want me to? You have Seo's extension. She went to the door, gave the instruction to Seo, came back and stood near her original position. She felt the specific discomfort of being present in a room where something irrevocable was about to be decided. The discomfort of knowing that the information she'd provided was about to be translated into consequences she would not observe and probably didn't want to. Cho arrived in 4 minutes. Min-jae spoke to him in Korean, low and direct. Cho listened without expression, nodded once, and left. The entire exchange took 45 seconds. Min-jae turned back to her. You'll stay on this floor today. All right. If Sung-ho attempts to contact you, he won't, she said. He doesn't know what I found. Nobody does except you. A beat. And me, she added, because that was the accurate version. He looked at her with that particular attention she'd stopped trying to categorize. Are you all right? The question surprised her. Not the words, the tone, the specific, unguarded quality of it. I'm fine, she said. You've spent 3 weeks finding the people who were destroying this organization, he said. That's not a neutral experience. She thought about Ji-won's face as he walked past the glass. She thought about Byun standing up from his desk with nowhere to go. She thought about Kim Sung-ho, a man she'd exchanged exactly 4 words with in 5 weeks, a man who had smiled at her once in the elevator with the easy comfort of someone who owned his place in the world, and what was about to happen to him. I do the work I'm asked to do, she said carefully. What happens after the work is yours. That's a precise boundary. It needs to be. He was quiet for a moment. Something in the set of his face told her he respected the answer and found it insufficient at the same time. Go back to your workstation, he said. I'll need you to compile the full documentation chain into a final report. Everything. 14 months, all 47 transactions, the complete subsidiary structure. By when? Tonight. She nodded. She went back to her desk. She put her hands on the keyboard and took one breath and started typing. At 11:40, she heard it. Not the confrontation itself, which happened somewhere below her, but the aftermath of it, which rose through the building's infrastructure the way pressure rises through pipes. A change in the movement patterns of the floor. Seo making a phone call in rapid Korean, voice-controlled but not quite neutral. Cho returning to the 13th floor, coming directly to Min Jae's office, closing the door. 15 minutes later, Min Jae emerged. He said to her, passing the workstation, "It's done." He went back inside. She understood what done meant and did not ask for elaboration, and kept her breathing even and typed the next sentence of the report and then the next one. At 2:15, her phone buzzed. Destiny. She let it go to voicemail. At 2:40, it buzzed again. Her mother this time, which she answered because she always answered her mother. Stepping away from the workstation to the far corner of the outer office, keeping her voice normal, asking about the furnace, listening to her mother talk about her sister Jade's new job situation with the half attention of someone whose other half was permanently occupied. She was walking back to her workstation when Seo looked up from his desk. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "someone in the lobby is asking for you." She stopped. Who? They didn't give a name. The desk security is calling up because the visitor doesn't have an appointment and is... They described the situation as insistent. Something moved through her that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite not alarm. "I'll go down." "The chairman has instructed that you don't leave the floor without..." "I'll just go to the lobby," she said. "It's probably my roommate. She's been trying to reach me." Seo looked uncertain. Seo's uncertainty was not an instruction, and she was not technically under any formal restriction, only a suggested one. And the lobby of the building, with its security desk and its cameras and its doorman, felt like a sufficiently safe radius from the 13th floor. She took the elevator down. The lobby was its usual composition: desk, doorman, the polished steel doors onto the street, 2 people waiting near the far wall. She looked for Destiny's particular silhouette and didn't find it. What she found instead was a man she didn't recognize. Korean, mid-40s, in a suit that was slightly wrong, good quality but worn wrong, the kind of person who wasn't used to performing this particular kind of professional. He had the build of someone who existed in physical space very deliberately and the eyes of someone running 2 calculations simultaneously. He was holding a phone. He held it toward her. "Mr. Park would like to speak with you," he said. She looked at the phone. She looked at the man. She calculated, very quickly, the distance to the elevator, the distance to the security desk, the fact that she was in a lobby with cameras and a doorman and broad daylight through the glass doors, and the fact that the man in front of her had not made any threatening motion and was holding the phone with the body language of someone following very precise instructions about exactly what was and wasn't permitted to happen here. She was already reaching for the phone before she'd fully decided to, because she needed to hear the voice, because you couldn't assess a threat you hadn't measured. She took it. "Ms. Brooks," said a voice on the line, even-toned, precise, with the particular quality of someone who had long since stopped needing to perform authority because the authority was simply a condition of the space around him. "I'm glad you came down. That tells me you're a practical woman." "What do you want?" she said. "A conversation," Seokyeon said. "Nothing dramatic. I'm not interested in dramatic. A pause. I'm interested in information. You've been inside the Hanul organization for 5 weeks. You've been given extraordinary access. I'd like to understand what you've found. I'm not going to tell you that. No, he said. Not today, I know that. Another pause, measured, deliberate. I'm calling because I want you to understand something before you go back upstairs. Kangmin Jae is a man who uses people effectively. He's very good at making people feel chosen, valued, special. The word landed with the specific weight of someone who had chosen it carefully. You're not the first person he's made feel that way. The last one was a lieutenant named Park Jun-seo. Are you familiar with that name? She said nothing. Jun-seo found something for Min Jae, Seok-hyun said. Something important. Something that made him very useful. And when he'd found it, when Min Jae had extracted everything useful from the situation, Jun-seo had an accident on the West Side Highway. A pause. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you this because I think you're intelligent enough to ask yourself what happens to the auditor who knows where all the bodies are buried once there are no more bodies left to find. Nia held the phone. Her hand was steady. Her chest was not. I'm trying to give you information, he said, not unkindly. That's all. Think about it. When you're ready to have a real conversation, the man standing across from you has a number. A pause. Take care of yourself, Ms. Brooks. New York is a dangerous city for people who don't understand their own position in it. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. She looked at the man across the lobby. He was watching her with the flat attention of a professional waiting for a conclusion. She handed the phone back without speaking, turned, and walked to the elevator bank. She pressed 13. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator's rise and breathed the way she'd learned to breathe when her brain was doing things she needed it to do cleanly. Slow, even, through the nose. She cataloged what she'd heard. She ran the variables. Park Jun-seo, West Side Highway. She didn't know if it was true. She didn't know if it was manufactured, a tool, a blade designed specifically for the gap between a woman's logical assessment of her situation and the part of her that had been noticing, for weeks, things she wasn't supposed to notice. She didn't know, and that was the problem. She'd spent 5 weeks building certainty out of document patterns and routing codes and financial architecture. She was very good at that. She was not equipped to build certainty out of this, out of the space between what a man showed and what he contained, between the pastries left without a note and a story about someone named Yoon-seo and a highway. The elevator opened. She walked to Min Jae's door. She knocked. Come. She pushed it open and stood in the doorway. He was at his desk. He looked up and read her face in the 2 seconds it took her to cross to the desk, and she watched him set down what he was holding. What happened? He said. Someone called me from the lobby, she said. A man with a phone. Seok-hyun was on the line. The room changed temperature. Min Jae stood, slowly, with the quality of motion that precedes something large and controlled and not yet fully deployed. What did he say? He asked me to give him information about what I found. She met his eyes. I didn't. Then he told me about someone named Park Jun-seo. The stillness that followed was absolute. She watched his face in it. She watched it very carefully, the way she'd watched account documentation for the patterns that preceded truth, not looking for what was presented, but for what moved underneath the presentation, in the micro-adjustments, in the weight distribution of expression. What she saw lasted less than 2 seconds before it was controlled again, but she saw it. Tell me exactly what he said, Min Jae said. His voice was even, completely even. The evenness of someone deploying every resource available to maintain the surface, while something beneath it did work she couldn't observe. She told him, word for word the way she remembered things, completely, linearly, without interpretation. She watched his face while she talked and kept her own face neutral and let the words sit in the room and mean what they meant. When she finished, he was quiet. Jun-seo, he said. Not a question. He said accident, West Side Highway. A long pause. Jun-seo died 14 months ago, Min Jae said. The circumstances were investigated by people inside this organization and outside it. There was no... He stopped. His jaw was tight. Seok-hyun uses things. He finds the shape of a concern and he builds it into a weapon. He looked at her directly. Do you believe him? She held the question for a moment, the honest moment. I don't know, she said. Something moved across his face. Not offense, not anger. Something more interior than that, more costly. "That's fair," he said quietly. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said. "I'm telling you I don't know, because I don't. And I think you know the difference between those two things." "I do." He looked at her. "What do you need?" She considered that. The truth about Junseo. He was quiet for long enough that she understood it was a complicated ask. Not because the answer was complicated, but because giving it required a specific kind of choice about what she was to him, about whether she was someone to be managed or someone to be trusted with the actual weight of a thing. He moved back to his desk. He sat. He was quiet for another long moment, and then he began to talk. Not in the compressed, controlled language he used for operational information, but in the slightly different register of a man telling something true. He told her about Junseo. He told her the real version, not the story Seo-kyun had constructed, but the actual sequence of events, including the parts that showed the organization poorly, including his own role in it, including the fact that Junseo's death had been a loss that had left a specific kind of mark. She listened. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without performing response. When he finished, she sat with it. She ran it against Seo-kyun's version, looking for the shapes that didn't fit. "I believe you," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You shouldn't take that on faith." "I'm not," she said. "I'm taking it on the specific quality of your account and the specific places where it makes you look worse than Seo-kyun's version, which is not what a person constructing a story does." She paused. "I know what manufactured truth looks like. It's too clean. Yours isn't." He held her gaze for a long moment, something in it that she still didn't have the right word for. "Go back to the report," he said finally. "I need to make some calls." She stood to leave. Nia, her name. Not Ms. Brooks. Her name, in his voice, for the first time, and something about the sound of it in that room moved through her chest in a way she absorbed without expression and filed somewhere she would deal with later. She turned. "Don't go into the lobby again without telling me," he said. "I know," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." She went back to her workstation. She sat. She placed her hands on the keyboard. She breathed. She typed the next line of the report. At 6:47, she finished. She sent the completed documentation chain to Min Jae's secure server, all 14 months, all 47 transactions, the full subsidiary map, the complete evidence structure. She organized the physical copies. She shut down her monitor. She put on her jacket. She was reaching for her bag when Seo's phone rang. He answered it, spoke 2 words, and turned to her with the particular expression of someone who had been trained to deliver information neutrally and was finding it a less natural task than usual. "There's a situation," he said. "The chairman has been called out of the building. He wants you to remain on this floor until he—" Then Nia's phone rang. Not her work phone. Her personal cell. An unknown number. She answered it because she'd learned in the past week that she answered unknown numbers now. "Ms. Brooks," said the voice. A different man this time. Not Seo-kyun. Someone lower. Someone operational. Someone whose tone carried the specific flat efficiency of a person executing an instruction rather than making a decision. "Don't make any sound. Don't react in a way that alerts the assistant. Walk normally to the elevator and go to the lobby. We have your roommate." The floor of her stomach simply dropped. "If you contact anyone in the building in the next 5 minutes," the voice continued with the same efficient flatness, "Destiny Williams will have an extremely bad evening. Walk to the elevator, take it to the lobby, step outside. A car will be waiting." Nia stood completely still. Seo was looking at her. She felt it. And she arranged her face around the fact that she was being asked to perform normal while her entire nervous system was rewriting itself around 2 words. Destiny Williams. They knew her name. They knew her roommate's name. They knew enough to have found her. Enough to be holding her as a specific, verified threat, not a bluff. She looked at Seo. She gave him a smile that cost her more than anything she'd done in 5 weeks. "I'm just going to get some air," she said. 5 minutes. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stepped inside. The doors closed and she stood in the elevator's descent with the phone still in her hand and Destiny's name still in the air and the certainty that she was making the worst decision of her life, directly adjacent to the certainty that the only alternative was worse. The lobby doors opened in front of her and the November air hit her face like a hand and she walked through them. The car was there. Black, idling at the curb. The rear door already open. A man standing beside it with the body language of someone who had done this before and found it neither interesting nor troubling. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The open door was the instruction, and Destiny's name was the enforcement, and Naya got in because there was no version of the next 5 minutes in which she didn't. The door closed. The car moved. She sat in the back seat and breathed and looked at her phone and understood that she had approximately 90 seconds before the building's security system flagged her exit, before CO noticed she'd been gone longer than 5 minutes, before Minjae was reached by someone who would tell him what had happened. She understood that she was making calculations about a man she wasn't entirely certain of, using evidence she'd assembled from tone and expression and a story that made him look bad, and she understood that certainty was a luxury she did not currently have. She texted 3 words to the most recent number in her call log, the number she'd saved under no name, just a string of digits she'd memorized the first time it appeared on her screen because she memorized things automatically and because some part of her had understood, even then, that there might be a moment when she needed it to already be there. 3 words. Car. Going south. She locked the screen. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. The man in the passenger seat turned and held out his hand. She gave him the phone without expression because she'd already sent what she needed to send, and arguing over it now served nothing. They drove south through the wet Manhattan evening, and she sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and worked on keeping her breathing even and her mind clear because panic was information loss, and she could not afford information loss right now. She thought about Destiny, practical, loud, fiercely perceptive Destiny, who had been her anchor in this city for 3 years, and converted the fear that came with that thought into something colder and more usable. Anger, clarity, the specific focus that comes when the thing you're protecting stops being abstract. She had been underestimated her entire life. She had decided, at some point too early to fully remember, to make that a structural advantage. The warehouse was in Red Hook. She knew that before they arrived because she knew Brooklyn's waterfront geography the way she knew account architectures. Through the pattern of turns, the gradient of the descent toward water, the specific quality of light that comes off the harbor at this hour through industrial-grade windows. They pulled into a loading dock through a rolling steel door, and when the door came down behind them, the sound it made was final in the way doors only sound final when you understand you're on the wrong side of them. She was out of the car before the man beside her had fully processed that she'd moved. Not running. There was nowhere to run, and she knew it. Just standing on her own terms, on her feet, oriented, before anyone could decide how she arrived. The warehouse was large and inadequately lit and smelled of salt water and rust, and the particular cold that lives in buildings that haven't been heated in months. She registered 4 men that she could see and assumed more that she couldn't. Metal folding chair in the center of the space, facing a table, facing a man she recognized from nothing but recognized immediately anyway. Park Seo-kyun was shorter than she'd constructed him from his voice. This happened sometimes. Voices carried more mass than the bodies behind them. He was in his mid-50s, compact, with the particular physical economy of a man who had spent decades learning that stillness was more threatening than motion. He was dressed without spectacle. Dark suit, no tie, the dressed-down deliberateness of someone who had stopped needing to perform his own seriousness. He looked at her the way she'd looked at the account documents, like a pattern he was trying to complete. "Sit," he said. "Where's Destiny?" she said. He gestured to the left. She turned her head. A controlled turn. Not a snap, because snapping was the response of someone being managed, and she was working very hard not to be managed. In a glass-walled office along the warehouse's left wall, visible through the grimy panes, she could see Destiny sitting in a chair. Upright, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who was furious rather than afraid, which was so completely Destiny that something moved through Nia's chest that had grief and love and terror all folded inside it. Destiny was alive, uninjured as far as she could see. Destiny saw her and her expression shifted, the fury cracking for exactly 1 second before she rebuilt it. Nia turned back to Seo-kyun. She sat. "She stays unharmed," Nia said. "That's entirely up to you," Seo-kyun said. "Not cruel about it, just factual. I'm a practical man, Ms. Brooks. I don't want to hurt anyone I don't need to hurt. What I need is information and time, and one of those you can give me right now." He sat across from her, unhurried, with the body language of someone conducting a meeting. "The full documentation. What you compiled. Where it's stored. Who else has seen it? You want the evidence chain. I want the evidence chain, the access codes that produced it. and a detailed account of how far the audit went. He folded his hands on the table. The gesture was almost professorial. In exchange, your friend goes home. Tonight. Unharmed. And you have 72 hours before the situation with Kang Min-jae becomes unavoidable. She looked at him steadily. Unavoidable. I'm going to move against him, Seok-hyun said, with the flat specificity of a man announcing weather. That is not a variable. What is a variable is whether you're inside that building when it happens. He paused. I'm offering you an exit, Ms. Brooks. I'm not a man who offers exits often. I'm offering you one because I think you're intelligent enough to understand your actual position. My actual position, she said. You're an outsider in his organization. You've been useful to him. That utility has an expiration date. It ended approximately 4 hours ago when the last corrupt officer was removed. He let that sit. He has no more use for your particular skill set. What he has is a woman who knows exactly how his financial infrastructure works, who has access to information that could damage him severely in the wrong hands. He paused. You're not an asset anymore. You're a liability. She thought about Jun-seo. She thought about the specific quality of Min-jae's voice when he'd told her the real version, the parts that didn't reflect well on him. She thought about the text she'd sent and whether it had been received and whether the man who received it was currently making decisions about her that she was either right or catastrophically wrong to anticipate. She thought about the pastries left without a note. How long do I have to decide, she said. You're deciding now, Seok-hyun said. That's what this conversation is. Then I need to use the bathroom. He looked at her. She held the look without moving. Something in her specificity, the bathroomness of it, the ordinary human logistics of it, seemed to recalibrate his read of the situation just enough. He gestured to one of the men behind her. Take her. She was walked to a bathroom at the far end of the warehouse, a door that locked from the inside. She went in. She locked it. She stood at the sink and ran the water and looked at herself in the mirror above it and did the accounting. Destiny was alive. That was the central fact. Everything else was navigable if that stayed true. She looked around the bathroom. Industrial, bare, one small window above the toilet, glass frosted, wire reinforced. She climbed onto the toilet and looked at the window's latch. Old, painted over twice, the kind that required force rather than technique. She worked it with the flat of her palm for 20 seconds, the paint seal cracking, the metal grinding, and got it open 3 inches before it stopped. Not enough to go through, enough to be heard from, if the timing was right. She looked at the window. She looked at the door. She thought about what she knew about the building's layout from the approach, from the sight lines she'd cataloged on the walk from the car. One main entrance through the loading dock, one fire door on the east wall that she'd seen as they passed, windows on the north side only. She got down from the toilet. She ran the water again. She looked at herself in the mirror and said quietly, in the voice she used for the things she had to say out loud to make them real, you are not a liability, you are not a tool, and you are absolutely not going to give him anything. She unlocked the door. She walked back to the chair. She sat down. I need more time, she said. Seok-hyun looked at her with the patience of a man who had expected exactly this. You have 5 minutes, he said. Then I make a phone call and your friend's evening becomes more complicated. She nodded. She sat with her hands in her lap. She breathed. She was counting. Not time. Distance. The distance between the chair she was sitting in and the glass-walled office where Destiny was. 30 feet. Maybe 35. The 2 men between her and that office were standing at the midpoint, which meant 15 feet to cross before anyone could intercept a direct run at full speed. She was not fast. She was not built for fast, but she was built for leverage, for using what she had instead of what she didn't. And what she had was the specific knowledge that Seok-hyun did not want to hurt Destiny, which meant any action she took toward that office would generate a response oriented around containment rather than damage. She also had the chair. She looked at the chair she was sitting in. Metal legs, the frame of the back joint slightly compromised, the way institutional chairs always were after years of use. She tested it with the flat of her palm against the back, very slightly, enough to feel the give. She looked at the glass wall of the office. She thought, this is the most reckless thing I have ever done in my life. And then she stopped thinking and moved. She came up out of the chair with its full weight already in both hands, turning the pivot into momentum the way she'd turned every awkward physical moment in her life into something she survived rather than something that stopped her. And she did not throw it through the glass wall because that would have taken too long and required too much accuracy. She swung it at the nearest man's knees, low and lateral, the way you hit something when you want it to go down and stay down rather than feel it. He went down. She was already running, 15 feet. She covered it in the suspended, terrible seconds of a person running who knows they are not fast enough and runs anyway. And she hit the office door with her shoulder and her full weight. And it opened. Unlocked. It had been unlocked. He hadn't thought she'd be stupid enough to try this, which was the precise advantage of being consistently underestimated. And she was inside. Destiny was on her feet before the door finished opening. Naya. Window, Nia said. Now. Which one? Destiny was already moving. She'd been planning her own exit, of course she had. Destiny Williams had been planning exits since they were 22 and broke in Detroit. Pointing to the north-facing window, she'd worked loose during the time she'd been sitting here alone. Because Destiny's response to captivity was apparently the same as Nia's, immediate, systematic, practical fury. The window was open 3 inches. Nia grabbed the frame and pulled. Her arm shook. The metal ground. Behind her, she could hear the warehouse floor reorganizing itself around the situation. Feet on concrete, voices in Korean, the particular sound of men who had been caught off guard recalibrating. The window gave. Go, Nia said. You first. Destiny. Go. Destiny went. She was smaller, faster. She dropped to the ground outside with a sound that was mostly controlled and partly not. Nia was halfway through the window frame when the office door opened behind her and a hand closed on her left ankle. She kicked, hard. Connected with something that produced a sound from the man behind her that she would not feel bad about later. The grip loosened. She dropped. The ground on the other side was wet gravel, and the impact took her at the knee and the palm of her right hand, and she processed the pain as data, not broken, bruised, continuing, and was on her feet before she'd fully registered falling. Destiny grabbed her arm. They ran. The waterfront behind the warehouse was a working dock, not tourist-facing, not clean, just functional industrial waterfront with the particular midnight geography of cranes and shipping containers and amber security lights that turned the puddles on the ground into small mirrors. They ran through it, Destiny pulling, Nia with her knee already telling her something she was choosing not to hear, and the sound behind them was the sound of pursuit beginning. Then the sound changed. The sound changed in the way that sounds change when the source of them multiplies suddenly, and what was one thing becomes several things. What was pursuit becomes something more like siege, and Nia pulled Destiny behind a shipping container and pressed her back against the corrugated steel and breathed and listened. Engines. Multiple. Not from the warehouse, from the perimeter, from the street side and the dock side simultaneously. A coordinated arrival that was moving toward the warehouse rather than away from it, and she heard, over the sound of her own heartbeat, the very specific acoustic signature of armored vehicles doing work they were designed for. Destiny pressed against her. What is that? Nia closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. That, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, is the answer to a text message. The warehouse exploded into light first. Searchlights from vehicles she couldn't see, flooding the building's north face with the particular brutality of tactical illumination. Then sound. The loading dock door going in, not opening, going in. The industrial steel folding under something that had been specifically brought to fold it. And the first concentrated burst of controlled chaos that is the sound of a professional entry team moving through a structure with the specific purpose of ending the thing happening inside it. She pulled Destiny tighter against the container. The sounds were not distant. The sounds were close and getting closer, and everything she understood about the situation told her to stay exactly where she was and not move, and let the geometry of the assault keep them in the rear margin of it. Destiny's hand was shaking against her arm. Don't let go, Nia said. I'm not, Destiny said. Her voice was raw. I'm not letting go. The sounds moved. The weight of the action shifted from the perimeter to the interior, the way a storm moves when the front is passed and what's left is resolution. Not quiet, not safe, but directed. She heard voices in Korean, short and command-structured. She heard footsteps on the dock toward them and pressed herself further against the container, and then the footsteps stopped. Ms. Brooks? Cho's voice. She'd know it by now. The economy of it, the particular way it delivered information without ornamentation. She came out from behind the container. Cho was standing 6 feet away with 2 men behind him, and he looked at her with the same controlled expression he always wore and said, "Are you hurt?" "My knee," she said. "I'm fine. This is Destiny. She's... I know who she is." He was already moving, already gesturing to one of the men behind him. "We have a car on the south side. Go with Park." "Seok-hyun is being handled." The word landed with the weight of someone who knew exactly what it meant and had no interest in elaborating. "Go, now." She didn't go. She looked at the warehouse. Its north face was still lit, still active, the sounds from inside it moving toward resolution, but not there yet. She looked at Cho, who was looking back at her with the expression of a man who had been given an instruction and had estimated correctly that she was not going to follow it until she understood what she was leaving. "He's in there," she said. Cho looked at her. A long moment. "Yes." "Is it... It's being handled," he said again. A pause. Something in his face shifting slightly toward a register she'd never seen from him before. "He went in for you, Ms. Brooks. He got your text, and he went in." He held her gaze. "Let us finish the job." She stood on the wet dock with gravel in her palm and her knee throbbing and Destiny's hand in hers and the sounds of the warehouse moving through the cold air around her. And she stood there long enough to make the choice deliberately, which was the only way she knew how to make choices that mattered. Then she let Cho's man walk them to the car. She sat in the back seat. Destiny was beside her, close, their shoulders touching in the way of people who had run together. Destiny's face was still arranged around the fury. The fury that meant she was scared, had been scared, and was converting it the way Brooks women converted things that threatened to unmake them. "I'm sorry," Nia said. Destiny looked at her. "Don't." "I should have told you." "You should have," Destiny said. "You absolutely should have. We are going to have that conversation for several hours at some point in the near future." She paused. "But right now, I am just..." Her voice broke slightly, rebuilt itself. "I'm just glad you came." Nia looked at her hands in her lap. The right palm was scraped, bleeding slightly, grit embedded in the heel of it. She looked at it with the detached precision of someone cataloging damage and understood that she was doing that because the alternative was feeling all of it at once, and she didn't have the space for that yet. She thought about what Cho had said. He went in for you, not for the resolution of the conflict, not for the operational conclusion. He'd gotten a 3-word text from a woman he'd told to stay on the floor, and he'd moved. The timeline of the assault, the coordinated perimeter arrival, the multi-point entry, that wasn't improvised. He'd had the resources, and he'd deployed them immediately, which meant the moment that text hit his phone, he'd made one decision and executed it without the hesitation of a man conducting a cost-benefit analysis. She sat with that in the dark car and the wet harbor air coming through the cracked window and tried to build a version of it that was purely organizational, purely tactical, the response of a chairman protecting an asset. She couldn't build it. The numbers didn't add up. Outside, through the windshield, the warehouse's amber lights were still burning against the night sky. And somewhere inside that building, Kang Min-jae was either finished or finishing the last thing between here and whatever came next. And Nia sat in the car with her scraped hand and her aching knee and the certainty that she needed to see him walk out of that building upright and intact, needed it in a way that she was done pretending was professional, done categorizing as observational, done filing anywhere except exactly where it actually lived. The radio on the dashboard crackled. One of the men in front answered it. A brief exchange. He turned to the back seat. "They've cleared the building," he said. Nia looked at the warehouse. The loading dock, the one the armored vehicle had taken off its hinges, was a rectangle of light in the building's face, and figures were moving through it, and she was scanning them with the specific focus of someone looking for one particular silhouette when the car door opened and Cho was there. "He's asking for you," Cho said. She was out of the car before he finished the sentence, and Destiny said something behind her that she didn't fully hear, and she was moving across the wet gravel toward the blown-open door, with her knee making its objections known at every step, and her chest doing something she had thoroughly run out of capacity to manage. She went through the door. The warehouse interior was controlled chaos resolving into order, men moving with purpose, securing the space, a systematic human machinery doing what it had been built to do. She moved through it without stopping, without looking at the things she was choosing not to look at, following the spatial logic of the room toward its center. She found him near the east wall. He was standing. That was the first thing she registered. Standing, upright, self-supported. And the relief that came with that single fact moved through her entire body in a wave she couldn't have suppressed if she'd tried. He had blood on his left arm, his jacket gone, his shirt sleeve torn and dark at the upper arm with something she'd assess in a moment, and there was a cut along his jaw that was going to bruise dramatically, and his hair was wrong in the way it gets wrong in a fight, and he was looking at her from 12 feet away with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not controlled, not compressed, not the chairman. Just a man who had been afraid of something specific and was standing on the other side of it, looking at the thing he'd been afraid of losing. She crossed the 12 feet. She stopped in front of him. She looked at the wound on his arm. A slash, not a bullet. She determined this in 3 seconds. Bad, but not critical. Already being seen to by a man with a kit who Minjae had apparently been ignoring in favor of watching the door. She looked at his face. "You're hurt," she said. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was different. She'd never heard it at this pitch before. See? Still low, but stripped of its usual architecture. The controls still there, but barely. Present through effort rather than instinct. "My hand. I fell." She looked at him. "Your arm needs pressure." "I know." "Then let him—" She gestured at the man with the kit. "In a minute." He looked at her. Just looked at her, with the specific attention of someone taking inventory of a thing they weren't certain they were going to have. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Your friend?" "She's in the car. She's fine. She's angry at me, which means she's fine." He exhaled. It was not a large exhale. It was the compressed release of someone who had been holding a specific kind of pressure since the moment a 3-word text arrived on their phone, and now the pressure had somewhere to go. She watched it move through him and felt something crack open in the middle of her chest that she had absolutely no ability to close back up. "Minjae," she said. The name. His name, for the first time. In her voice. And she watched what it did to his face. The last layer of the professional composure. The one that had survived everything tonight. The one that had survived 14 years of building a world where he didn't need anything he couldn't secure. She watched it go. He reached up with his uninjured arm, and his hand found the side of her face. And it was not a small gesture, and it was not a managed one. It was the gesture of a man who had stopped managing this particular thing. And she let it happen. She let it happen. His hand was cold from the November air, and slightly unsteady in the way hands are unsteady after a body has run on adrenaline long enough to burn through its own resources. And she felt that tremor against her face, and it told her more about the cost of tonight than any of the blood or the torn sleeve or the cut along his jaw that was already swelling dark at the edge. She put her hand over his, the scraped one, the one with the grit still embedded in the heel of it, and held it there. Neither of them said anything. Around them, the warehouse continued its systematic resolution. Men moving, voices in Korean issuing and receiving instructions, the particular sounds of a space being secured and cataloged. And in the middle of all of it, they stood still, which was its own kind of decision. Then the man with the medical kit cleared his throat with the polite desperation of someone who had been waiting for a window and was not sure how much longer he could professionally defer. Minjae dropped his hand. He looked at her once more with that unguarded expression, not gone, not resealed, just receded to a place that felt different from the controlled distance she'd spent 5 weeks studying. Then he sat on a crate and extended his injured arm and let the man work. She stood beside him, close enough that their arms were almost touching. Neither of them acknowledged this. Cho appeared from across the warehouse with the movement of a man carrying a report. He stopped in front of Minjae and delivered it in Korean, low and direct. Minjae listened without expression, asked one question, received the answer. Cho left. "Sokhyun," Naya said. Not a question exactly. "Contained," he said. She looked at his face. "Contained means—" "It means he won't organize another operation against this organization," he said. His voice had returned toward its usual register. Not all the way, but closer. The architecture rebuilding itself the way structures do after the load passes. "He's alive. What happens next is not my decision." She understood this to mean that Seok-hyun's fate had moved into the category of consequences that existed outside Min-jae's immediate jurisdiction, above him, or beside him, or in the hands of people whose names she would never know. She didn't ask further. There were rooms in this situation that were not hers to enter, and she'd made her peace with that geography weeks ago. "His people who took destiny," she said. "They'll be found." No hesitation. All of them. She nodded. The medical kit man finished his work. Pressure bandage, clean, efficient, and stood and went. Minjae looked at his arm the way you look at something your body produced without consulting you, with the mild detached resentment of the professionally inconvenienced. "Let me see your hand," he said. She held it out. He touched it, both of his hands around hers, the injured arm working despite the bandage, and looked at the scraped heel of her palm with the same focused attention he brought to financial documents and tactical briefings. He turned her hand slightly to assess the depth. His thumbs were careful in a way that was very different from how careful they needed to be clinically, which she registered and said nothing about. "It's fine," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't let go. She looked at the top of his head, the dark hair, disarranged, the cut visible now from above, a clean-edged thing along his jaw that had bled into his collar and dried there. She thought about how close the geometry of an inch or two could be in a fight. She thought about what Cho had said. "He went in for you." She thought about the 3-word text she'd sent and the speed with which the perimeter response had arrived, and what that speed cost in terms of premeditation and risk, and what it indicated about the decision-making of the man currently holding her hand with his thumbs. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked up. "Ask." The speed of the response tonight, the vehicles, the entry team, that kind of deployment, she held his gaze. That wasn't reactive. That was organized in minutes. "Yes." "You've had assets positioned around my movements since Seo-kyun made contact with you in the lobby the first time," he said. "Since you came upstairs and told me about the phone call and Jun-seo." He paused. His expression was direct in a way that had no apology in it, but also no concealment. "I told you I had security arrangements in place. I was less specific than I should have been about what that looked like in practice." She absorbed this. "You had people watching me." "Yes." "Without telling me." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you now." She thought about how she felt about that. She ran it through the part of herself that had spent a lifetime being managed by people who thought they knew better. Teachers, employers, men in general. The particular taxonomy of people who made decisions about her life using her as a variable rather than a subject. She ran it through that and found, unexpectedly, that what came out the other side was not the clean anger she would have predicted. What came out was more complicated, because he hadn't used the surveillance to control her. He'd used it to be there when she needed it, at the precise speed that being there required. And he was telling her now, directly, without softening it, which was exactly what she'd asked of him from the first week, and which he'd given her every time she asked for it, even when it cost him something. "I want that to not happen without my knowledge going forward," she said. "All right," he said. "That means you tell me, not after, before." He looked at her steadily. "I understand what it means." "Good." She looked at their hands. "Then I understand why you did it." The silence that settled between them after that was different from any of the silences she'd catalogued before. Not the controlled quiet of a man managing his expression or the weighted pause of a professional exchange. Something that had more room in it. Something that felt, for the first time since she'd walked through those steel lobby doors 5 weeks ago, like the specific piece of two people who had stopped pretending they were only what they'd been hired to be to each other. She became aware gradually of the sounds of the warehouse diminishing, people finishing their work and moving out, the operational weight of the space lifting in increments. She became aware that Cho had been keeping a deliberate perimeter around them. Not surveillance, protection of a different kind, the protection of space, and she filed that away as information about what Cho understood about this situation that nobody had explicitly told him. "I need to go check on Destiny," she said. "I know." He released her hand, slowly, with the specific deliberateness of a choice rather than a reflex. "She should be brought somewhere safe tonight, my building on the east side. There are secured residential units. She's going to have questions about that offer. I imagine she'll have questions about everything." "She will. She's very thorough." Nia looked at him. "You should probably also know that she's going to look you directly in the eye and tell you exactly what she thinks of you, without any diplomatic filtration." Something moved through his expression that she'd been seeing more of in the past hour. The thing she'd originally catalogued as almost amusement, which she now understood was the genuine article, just wearing the only clothing available to a man who had spent decades performing his own impassivity. "I can manage directness," he said. "Not like hers, you can't," she said. "But you'll survive it." She went. Destiny was outside the car, standing in the dock's amber light with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, And when she saw Nia coming, she stood straighter and her chin came up in the particular way of someone refusing to cry in front of an audience. She waited until Nia was close enough that the embrace was the only logical next action, and then pulled her in with the force of a person who had been holding something very tightly for several hours. They stood like that for a moment, just stood. "You need to explain everything," Destiny said into her shoulder. "Every single thing, starting from the beginning." "I will. Tonight." "Tomorrow," Nia said. "Tonight you need a hot shower and a locked door, in that order." Destiny pulled back and looked at her. At the scraped hand, the knee she was favoring, the general condition of a woman who had climbed through a warehouse window and run across a wet dock, and the fury and the relief and the love that Destiny Williams carried for her moved across her face in their natural sequence. "You are so much trouble," Destiny said. "I know." "You owe me a tremendous amount of explanation." "I know." "And food," Destiny said. "Actual food, not whatever you call the things you eat when you forget to eat." "Tomorrow," Nia said. "I promise." She got Destiny into the car with one of Cho's men and watched the car pull away from the dock and held the breath she'd been conserving since she'd heard Destiny's name on the phone in the elevator. The cold waterfront air moved around her and she stood in it for a full minute before going back inside. The warehouse was nearly empty now. The operational residue of the assault was being systematically removed. Not clean, not sanitized, simply made less present in the way that people who do this kind of work have systems for. She found Min Jae near the east wall again, standing, jacket on now over the bandaged arm, the cut on his jaw cleaned if not treated. He was on his phone, finishing a call in the clipped Korean of logistics, and when he saw her, he ended it. They walked out together. Not side by side exactly. The doorway required filing through sequentially, but with the quality of two people who are occupying the same navigational intention. The dock outside was cold and quiet, the harbor beyond it dark and moving. Cho was by the remaining cars, present and not obtrusively so. They stopped at the water's edge. Not a planned stop, just the natural terminus of walking when there's water in front of you and the night behind you and something unfinished in the air. She looked at the harbor. He stood beside her. The amber lights of the dock were behind them and the city across the water was its usual brilliant, indifferent sprawl. "I found something else," she said. "Before all of this tonight. I didn't get to tell you." He waited. "The subsidiary structure that Sung-ho built for the account diversions? There's a fourth layer I didn't include in the report because I couldn't fully document it in time." She looked at the water. "It's clean now. The access codes were changed when you removed him, but it existed, and it connected to an external account in Seoul that I think predates his arrangement with Seok-hyun by several years." She paused. "It means he was hedging before Seok-hyun, building an exit before he even started the betrayal." Min Jae was quiet. "He was planning to leave," she said, "the whole time. Everything he built for you, he was building a door out of simultaneously." She looked at him. "I thought you should know that part. Not for the investigation. The investigation is closed. Just because you deserve to know the whole shape of it." He looked at the water. His jaw was tight in the way she'd come to recognize as something other than anger. The expression of a man processing weight rather than resisting it. 22 years, he said. "I know." "My father trusted him." "I know." The silence was not uncomfortable. She'd stopped finding his silences uncomfortable around week 3, when she'd understood that they were not absences but presences, that he was more in them than out of them, that the quiet was where he actually lived. "The organization," he said, "what I run, the things you've understood about it over these weeks." He looked at her finally, directly. "You've never pretended it was something else?" "No. Most people either pretend it's worse than it is or pretend it's legitimate." He paused. "You've looked at it as it is." "I've looked at it as it is," she agreed. "Does that—" He stopped, started differently. "I'm asking what you want, going forward. That's not a question I'm accustomed to asking." She understood what the question actually contained. It wasn't about her employment terms or her role or her security arrangement. It was the question that had been building in the space between them since a man in a ruined shirt had looked at her in a hallway and said 2 words that weren't anger and weren't dismissal and weren't anything she'd been prepared for. She thought about Detroit, about the particular discipline of growing up in a house where love was present but resources were not, where you learned early that wanting things you couldn't name was less useful than doing the work in front of you. She thought about 4 failed jobs and a student loan statement, and an apartment in Brooklyn that she'd been using primarily as a location to sleep between working. She thought about what it felt like in 5 weeks to have her work matter in a way it never had before. Not just competent, not just adequate, but genuinely, consequentially necessary. And then she thought about pastries left without a note, about a man who had said why not in a voice that was asking a real question, about the look on his face in this warehouse tonight, stripped of all its professional architecture, just a man standing on the other side of something he'd been afraid of. "I want to keep doing the work," she said. "The analytical work. I'm good at it, and it matters here in ways it didn't matter anywhere else." She paused. "And I want whatever else is happening to happen without either of us pretending it isn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a precise request." "I'm a precise person." "I know." Something in his face, not the almost amusement this time, something quieter, something that sat deeper. "I should tell you that I don't have a framework for this, for whatever else is happening. I've spent a long time building systems that don't require it." "I know," she said. "I'll make errors." "So will I," she said. "I've been making errors since I walked into your building. You haven't fired me yet." The thing in his face went somewhere fuller, not quite a smile. His face wasn't built for uncomplicated smiles. There was too much in the way. But the precursor to one, the structural suggestion of a man who had been reminded that warmth was a thing his body still knew how to do. "No," he said. "I haven't." He reached over and tucked her scraped hand inside his. Not the careful clinical hold from earlier, but the simple practiced ease of someone who has decided to stop holding something at arm's length. His fingers were warm now. The cold worked out of them, and she turned her hand over and held his back. They stood at the water's edge in the November dark. The harbor moved. The city lights made their usual promises across the water, indifferent and gorgeous. Behind them, the warehouse stood with its blown-in door, and somewhere in the middle distance, 2 cars carried the remnants of the night's damage toward their respective resolutions, and the Hanuel Syndicate, present and intact on the other side of its own most serious internal rupture, continued its operations in the 1,000 invisible ways that complex organizations continue their operations when the crisis is over and the daily machinery reasserts itself. The next morning came the way mornings always come after the nights that change the shape of things. Not gently, not with ceremony, just incrementally lighter, the dark becoming gray, becoming the specific pale blue of November dawn over the East River. Nia sat at the kitchen table in the secured East Side unit with a cup of coffee and her laptop and the final version of the consolidated report, which she'd finished at 2 in the morning because her brain had refused to rest until the document was complete. The unit was not hers. She'd need to go back to Brooklyn, need to have the long conversation with Destiny that had been deferred, need to make practical decisions about living arrangements in the context of a situation that had irrevocably changed the terms of her daily safety calculus. These were real problems that required real logistics, and she would address all of them. Currently, she was looking at the report. 14 months, 47 transactions, 3 corrupt captains and 1 CFO, with 22 years and an exit plan. A subsidiary network that had moved a significant portion of the Hanuel Syndicate's port revenue sideways over more than a year. The complete structure, documented, sourced, evidence to a standard that required no interpretation and left no ambiguity. She'd built it. Piece by piece, starting from a pattern she wasn't supposed to find in a document she'd been asked to route rather than read. Working through access tiers and routing codes and archive records in the focused, slightly manic state of someone for whom patterns were not optional, whose brain simply would not permit an unresolved sequence to remain unresolved. She looked at what she had built and felt the particular satisfaction of work completed at its full depth. Not pride exactly, she was too constitutionally practical for uncomplicated pride, but something adjacent to it. The satisfaction of having done the thing as well as it could be done and having been in a position to do it at all. Destiny emerged from the bedroom at 7:15 in borrowed clothes and the expression of a woman who had slept but not enough, carrying the accumulated weight of yesterday the way you carry things you need to eventually set down. She looked at Nia. She poured herself coffee. She sat across the table. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Nia said. "Start from the beginning." So Nia did. She told Destiny the whole shape of it, not the classified mechanics, not the names of people who couldn't be named, but the essential structure of what had happened and what it had turned into and where it stood now. She told it plainly, in the way she told things that mattered, without performance or softening, watching Destiny's face move through its full range of responses: fury, disbelief, fear, more fury, and finally the particular expression Destiny wore when she was revising her understanding of a situation and finding the new version more complicated than the one she'd arrived with. When Nia finished, Destiny was quiet for a moment. "The man who runs it," she said carefully. "The one who went into the warehouse. Min Jae. What is he to you?" Nia looked at her coffee. She looked at Destiny. She decided to give the honest answer because Destiny always knew the difference. "I don't have the right word for it yet," she said, "but he's something." Destiny looked at her for a long time with the deep, calibrating attention of a woman who had known her since they were 22 and had watched her navigate a world that kept trying to make her smaller than she was. The look contained 1,000 things, most of them complex, and at the end of it, Destiny said slowly, "You look different." "Different how?" "Like someone who has been seen." Destiny paused. "Like someone who stopped waiting to be." Nia sat with that. It landed somewhere real, somewhere that had been waiting for exactly that pressure, and she let it land rather than deflecting it, which was itself a kind of difference. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Maybe." Destiny picked up her coffee. "He better not hurt you." "I know how to handle myself." "I know you do," Destiny said. "I'm not worried about you handling yourself. I'm worried about the particular kind of damage that happens to people who are competent enough to survive everything except the things they actually let in." She looked at her. "Don't close it back up just because it's complicated." Nia didn't answer, but she didn't disagree either, which was its own kind of answer between them. The conversation about practical logistics took another hour. Destiny had opinions, which she expressed with characteristic thoroughness. Nia listened, agreed where she agreed, held her position where she didn't, and by the end of it they had the outline of a plan that addressed Destiny's safety, Nia's housing situation, and the general shape of what the next few weeks needed to look like. At 9 o'clock, Nia's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A single line. "When you're ready." "K." She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Destiny, who was reading the expression on her face with the fluency of 3 years of close proximity. Destiny raised an eyebrow. "Go," Destiny said. "You're sure?" "Nia, I have coffee, I have a locked door, and I have 3 years of grievances to organize into a coherent list." She waved a hand. "Go." She went. The building on 55th had the same polished steel doors and the same doorman and the same elevator that now responded to her biometric profile without requiring anything from her, which she noted as a change from 5 weeks ago when she'd stood in the lobby without a key card and taken a temporary access chip from a man with wire-rimmed glasses who counted her lateness. She rode to 13. She walked through the outer office past Seo, who said, "Good morning," with the precise warmth of someone who had expanded their professional register overnight, and knocked on the double doors. "Come." The office was the same as it had always been. The corner windows showed a pale winter morning over Park Avenue. The desk was uncluttered. The shelf of red books ran along the inner wall, the cracked spines visible from the door. He was standing at the window, his default position, his thinking position, and he turned when she entered. The cut on his jaw was bruised this morning, a dark stripe below the bone. His arm was in the bandage under his shirt. She could see the slight change in the sleeve's line. He looked like what he was, a man the day after a fight, wearing it without apology or performance. She looked like what she was too. Scraped hand, favored knee, the clear-eyed, slightly stripped-down quality of a person who has been through something and is standing on the other side of it with fewer protective layers than they arrived with. They looked at each other from across the room. "Destiny," he said. "She's all right. She's in the East Side unit." "Good. She's going to want to meet you eventually." A pause. "I'd recommend being honest with her. She's better at detecting evasion than most of the people in this building." "Noted." His expression moved. "Sit." She sat in the chair across from his desk. The same chair she'd sat in 5 weeks ago when he'd called her up to tell her she was doing the full audit, when she'd said "I believe you" in response to a question about being afraid, and watched something shift behind his eyes for the first time. She sat in it differently now. Not because the chair had changed, because she had, not in the fundamental ways, not in the things that were structural to who she was, but in the layer that governs how a person occupies space, how much room they permit themselves in a room that isn't theirs by any conventional standard. He came and sat across from her. He put a folder on the desk between them. She looked at it. "Employment contract," he said. New terms. The role is Head of Internal Financial Compliance. Direct report to me. Access to every account tier in the organization. Standing authorization to audit at any level, any time, without requiring prior approval. He paused. Compensation is significantly different from what you were offered 5 weeks ago. She looked at the folder without opening it. You're formalizing the arrangement. I'm making it permanent, he said, if you want it. She looked at him. The work or the... She stopped, started differently. Both? Both, he said. No hesitation. She looked at the folder. She thought about the furnace in her mother's house in Detroit, which she'd already arranged to have replaced 2 weeks ago, quietly, because the paycheck she'd been receiving was already extraordinary, and she was already practical with extraordinary things. She thought about the student loan statement. She thought about the pattern finding that had started in the archive room and moved through tiers of hidden architecture until it found the center of something that had been quietly rotting inside this organization for more than a year. She thought about what it felt like to do work that was seen, that was necessary, that moved through its consequences in real time and changed real things. She thought about the water's edge last night and the weight of his hand and Destiny's voice saying like someone who stopped waiting to be. She opened the folder. She read the contract. She read it completely, every clause, with the focused attention of someone who understood that documents said true things if you read them correctly. It was straightforward in its terms and extraordinary in its scope, the access, the authority, the compensation, the explicit protections. It was written by someone who understood that making this permanent meant making it real, and had built the document accordingly. She reached the signature line. She looked up. He was watching her with the patient, absolute attention of a man who had made his decision and was waiting for her to make hers, and there was nothing in his face that tried to influence the outcome. Nothing that performed patience or performed certainty, just the honest weight of a man sitting across a desk from the only person in a very long time who had looked at him fully and not looked away. She picked up the pen. She signed. She put the pen down and looked at him across the desk. Something had settled in the room. Not the resolving of tension exactly, because tension was not what had been between them, but the completion of something that had been building in increments since a cup of coffee and a ruined shirt and 2 words spoken in a hallway to a woman who expected to be fired and was told instead, flatly, it's fine. It had never been fine. It had always been this specific thing working toward this specific moment. The months that followed had the quality of things that are built rather than fallen into. She moved her work permanently to 13. She restructured the organization's financial compliance architecture from the inside out, systematically, methodically, in the way that she did things, with documentation and clear protocols and the particular rigor of someone who knew exactly how hidden damage worked and intended to make it structurally impossible. Cho and Bayek, who had initially treated her presence on the floor with the careful neutrality of men unsure what category she occupied, shifted towards something closer to professional respect, which expressed itself primarily through the delivery of accurate information without being asked and the clearing of logistical obstacles before she encountered them. Ms. Park on 12 said nothing about the change in Nia's reporting structure and treated her exactly as she had treated her from the beginning, with the precise, demanding standards she applied to everything, which Nia understood, over time, to be the closest thing to warmth Ms. Park's operational register permitted. Hannah sent her a message that said only, "I told you so," with no further elaboration, which Nia appreciated. Her mother came to visit in February. Nia told her she'd taken a new position with a private firm, which was true, and that it was going very well, which was also true, and that she was happy, which was the truest of all 3, and the one that took her mother the longest to believe, not because she doubted her daughter, but because she knew her, knew the particular way Nia had moved through the world since she was small, competent, careful, holding everything slightly away from the center of herself as a form of protection. Her mother sat in the East Side apartment that Nia had now made genuinely hers. Her books on the shelves, her Detroit Tigers mug in the cabinet, Destiny's voice through the wall on Sunday mornings, and looked at her daughter for a long time with the specific assessment of a woman who had raised her from nothing and knew every version of her face. "Something's different," her mother said. "I know," Nia said. "Good different." "Yeah, Mama, good different." Her mother looked at the apartment, the quality of it, the security of it, the evidence it contained of a life that had found its level, and then looked back at her daughter, and the expression on her face was the one Nia would keep the longest afterward. Not surprise. Something more specific than that. Something that looked like a mother watching the things she raised become completely, finally, irrevocably itself. In the spring, on a Tuesday that had no particular significance on the calendar, Min-jae stopped at her workstation on his way back from a board meeting and placed a white paper bag on the corner of her desk without speaking. Inside were 2 honey butter pastries from the Korean bakery on 53rd. She looked at the bag. She looked up at him. He was already moving toward his office, and his face gave nothing, which meant everything, which was the language she'd been learning since day one and was now fluent in. She ate both pastries. She went back to work. The Hanuel Syndicate remained what it was. Powerful, complex, morally unambiguous in the categories that mattered, and deeply ambiguous in the rest. An organization built by hard men for hard purposes in a city that generated both in abundance. Nia had no illusions about it. She never had. She worked within it with the full knowledge of what it was, building structures of internal accountability inside a structure that conventional accountability did not reach, which was not a contradiction she'd resolved so much as one she'd chosen to inhabit with clear eyes. Some evenings, once the floor was quiet and the city below the corner windows was doing its usual relentless work, she looked up from her desk and across the room at a man who had been feared his whole adult life and who sat in the late light reading something with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the cut on his jaw long since faded to nothing, and she thought about the word destiny had used. Seen. She thought about what it cost a person to be seen accurately and what it cost them more not to be, and she thought about the specific grace of having found, in a building she'd walked into with a coffee stain on her blazer and borrowed heels and 6 minutes of lateness, exactly the place where those two things, the work she was built for and the person who saw her doing it, had turned out to occupy the same room. She was not soft about it. She was not sentimental in any way that required softening the facts. The facts were what they were, difficult and costly and complicated in ways that had no clean resolution. The warehouse was real. Destiny's fear had been real. The things she'd uncovered in those accounts and what had followed them were real and had real weight, and she carried that weight with the honest acknowledgement of someone who had chosen to stay inside a complicated world rather than stand outside it pretending to be clean. But the other things were real too. The pastries, the hand at the water's edge, the voice saying her name for the first time in a room where they had both been stripped down to what they actually were underneath everything they'd built to survive. Those were real. And on a Tuesday in spring, in a corner office on the 13th floor of a building with no sign above its steel doors, with the city moving below them in its indifferent and magnificent way, Nia Brooks looked up from her desk and found Kang Min-jae already looking at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been watching develop for 5 months. The one that had started as something barely visible and had become, through the slow accumulation of pastries and silences and water's edge honesty, unmistakable. She held his gaze. He held hers. Outside, New York did what New York does. It moved, it pressed, it demanded. It generated the constant, beautiful noise of a place that has never once in its history stopped to ask whether the people inside it were ready. They were not entirely ready. They were exactly ready enough. That was all it ever took.